Well, thanks so much for having me. Let me just tell you a little bit about kind of who I am and my background, and then how I got in recently with imaging the recent wildfires in California. So my background, I've been in the drone and the UAV industry for about 4 years now, 3.5, 4 years. But I come from academia, so my PhD is in field ecology, and I was a professor for about 4 years, a tenure track at the University of British Columbia. And really my interest in drone technology was to measure and monitor plant experiments that I had going in my lab and with my graduate students. And so, doing research is super tedious, and it's often in kind of rural, remote locations, and so I wanted to use drones as kind of flying robots to map experiments out. And I got so excited about the technology that I did a foolish thing and left academia to join the drone industry. And foolish in that it's a big risk, and I had things like a regular paycheck and a pension and all those kind of things, and a whole lab and a career that I had spent 10 years building. But I was that excited about the technology that I left, and I joined 3D robotics. And this was about the time that 3DR was coming out with the Solo. You can see a picture of me in my 3DR kind of setup. And about a year afterwards or so, 3DR made the pivot away from hardware towards software. And so it was about that time then that I went over and started working for Parrot and the Parrot family of companies. And that was mostly to think about the Parrot Sequoia camera for vegetation mapping. So really drawing on my academic background in the plant sciences to come in on the commercial side. When Parrot made a pivot away from, they basically made a big reduction in their staff for financial reasons, trying to compete with DJI. And so I made the transition then over to Pix4D. They were in the same office, and so basically I left Parrot, went home for a week, and then came back to the same desk working for Pix4D, more on the data side. And that's really where I was involved with customers and businesses that are really trying to understand, like, how do you manage all of the data coming off the drone? And so really diving into saying less about the hardware and more about the imaging and the mapping capabilities of the drones. And so my background was really, and my involvement in that company was really to reach out to government, to agriculture, to academic researchers, so a lot of different folks that I had already been talking to in the drone industry, but in this case it was more for the imaging side. I started my own company about a year after working for Pix4D. I left Pix4D mostly for family reasons. So my wife is an executive director at a large nonprofit for children and family services in California, and she is the boss of like 100 people, and so someone needed to do daycare pickups and have a more flexible schedule, and I just couldn't travel as much as I had been working in the industry. And to be honest, I was actually a little bit ready for a break after being kind of through that meat grinder of the past couple of years in the drone industry itself. It's been a bit of a wild ride, and so I formed a company called Scholar Farms. And really all we do or all I do for the most part, it's just me and some contractors for the media side, is I built a whole masterclass online for plant mapping with drones. So that's like the niche that I focus on. I have about a 10-hour training that runs $400 for commercial training, but it runs through Parrot Sequoia, MicroSense Red-Edge, Slant Range, and a ton of different imaging products for vegetation mapping. So my customers that I work with tend to be large agricultural companies that want to build drones into their workflow, a lot of graduate students that are trying to get up and running for their projects. I contract with schools and universities who take my curriculum and use that on a semester-by-semester basis. So that's kind of what I do is plant mapping with drones. So how did I get involved in the wildfires and the law enforcement team? So this is Alameda County. So I live in Contra Costa County, which is right next to Alameda County. This is their UAV team. They're one of the most active UAV teams in the country for both law enforcement and also public safety. when I was working for Pix4D, I got pretty close with this team for the Ghost Ship Fire. The Ghost Ship Fire was a fire that happened in Oakland about a year and a half or so ago. And it was a club that was throwing a party, and they didn't have good exits, and about 30 college-age students were killed in that fire. They just couldn't get out. And so it was a huge deal, lots of public agencies involved, and they wanted to map the structure in close detail, and so they called me in to just help them in that mapping and visualization. There was a lot of pressure for them to get it right. And so that's when I first kind of helped them. And then after that, they would just call me. Actually, the commanders just called me right now. I have to text them and say I'll call them back. But they just call me up. And so when the big Sonoma fires happened last October, this is when about 3,500 homes in Santa Rosa went up overnight with the Tubbs fire. And what you're seeing here is a burned out trailer park. It was called Journey's Inn, unfortunate name, but it was called Journey's Inn, and a couple of people died in this fire. Again, elderly, they just couldn't get out. The fire moved in really quickly. And so they wanted to map this in close detail. And you can see us kind of over here on the right-hand side before they went in and started moving stuff around. So they wanted to get the data very quickly and then bring in the teams to start kind of combing through and looking for people, not survivors, but looking for bodies. From there, though, then we got called over immediately after we mapped that to the Coffee Park neighborhood. This was a much larger neighborhood of about 2,500 homes that had burned that night, a couple of nights before, and people were evacuated from this neighborhood, and they hadn't gone back in again. And so we ended up mapping this neighborhood. We were limited to 100 feet, or about 33 meters or so, because of the manned aircraft that were coming into the neighborhood, so it took lots and lots of flights. I'm getting a little feedback there from somebody. If you see the little pins in here where these little photos are, this was actually the first time that I tried using the 360 panoramics. And so if I clicked on one of these photos, you can see this is actually the very first time I tried using a 360 panoramic. And you can, when I saw the image, I was just shocked basically at the impact of what this imagery could take away. You know, I'm used to mapping and I can look at 10,000 photos, but being able to really pan around and see the destruction was really impactful. And so from there, we had lots of neighborhoods that had been hit by this fire. And so I had them download the Hangar app for DJI drones, and then they went out, and you can see a couple of pins down at the bottom here and up here, and there were some other neighborhoods that we were able to capture the imagery very quickly. And so what this allowed me to do basically is say, okay, we can't map all of this with the time that we have and at that 100 feet altitude. How do we scale these drone teams, these law enforcement drone teams very quickly and very easily? So they all don't know how to map and capture the imagery. At that time, I was just kind of hacking together solutions on my phone and trying to do the best that I could, but I knew that this would kind of work. And that whole method then led to the Carr Fire that started at the end of July here in California. So the Carr Fire, let me see if I can move this. The Carr Fire, here you can see a map of it. If you look at the boundary of the fire here, the red boundary, that's actually the most current area that is burned. So it's burned hundreds of square miles. And the result was not as impactful in terms of number of houses burned. There was about 1,000 houses that were burned, particularly in the Redding area. I'll zoom in on that. And CAL FIRE went in actually manually. Some of the teams went in and marked these homes that were burned immediately following when the fire had gone into the city of Redding in California. And then it moved then out into the rural areas, and it's about 90% contained now, so it's almost almost finished. So not as impactful in terms of the number of homes that were lost, but just a way larger area in terms of scale. And so they put out a request for assistance from the UAV teams from a couple of different agencies, and they wanted they sent me this KML file for Google Earth of the areas that were really hard hit. It ended up being about 2,000 acres, and I was able to go back then to this CAL FIRE map and reduce that down to about 1,000 acres. But still, we were capped at about 100 to 200 feet altitude to fly in because of all the manned aircraft that were in the temporary flight restriction. And so that was kind of the situation on the ground before they called the teams in. And so I really tried to do as much media. They called me to help out on the data side as the data analyst, and so then we all flew up. We went and drove up. So a couple of us flew, which was pretty fun. And then a lot of teams drove up with all the gear immediately afterwards. So here's a shot from the airplane flying up, about an hour flight up out of the Bay Area to Redding, or it's about a 3.5-hour drive with all the equipment. So from there, on the ground, then we got together with about 6 drone teams. We were briefed by the air boss, who's wearing the red hat there, from CAL FIRE in terms of what is the manned aircraft in the area, what they were going to be doing. And then from there, we basically broke the neighborhoods up into about 5 or 6 neighborhoods and 5 or 6 teams. We did a rapid training in terms of how to do these 360 panos as well as how to do the mapping. We did some basic mapping. And so here's a shot of us kind of dividing up the neighborhood. This was all in coordination with Redding Police and the city of Redding. So they were the one that requested the teams to come in, and then they were the one coordinating the effort. And I was just the one kind of managing like how we were going to capture the data and how we were going to then feed that as data products into the city GIS team. So we went out and deployed for 2 days, and there was a lot of troubleshooting that I won't get into, but we ended up, the best thing that we could do was caravan, and then we did this kind of leapfrogging where we would then we got in a rhythm of just each team would hopscotch over the next team or leapfrog over the next team, capture panos, and we were able to cover a pretty wide area. The different neighborhoods varied in how much they were damaged. So here's a neighborhood that you can see it was pretty patchy. There's some homes remaining and some homes that were burned. Other neighborhoods were hit harder where all the homes were burned, but there's still some trees and other things left in here. And then there was also some neighborhoods that it was just really post-apocalyptic, pretty terrible. This is the area that there was actually a fire tornado. This is a YouTube video of that tornado for the same neighborhood that came in. And you can just see that it's just incinerated this particular section. So really variable and patchy, but over a huge spatial scale. So here, within Hangar, all of these 360s are uploaded to a single world. And so we were able to basically sync all the imagery to a single location. And then the City of Redding GIS team, shown here, these guys were awesome. We were able to then hand that imagery off into their team, and they were able to manage it through their public database to visualize it and then make it public to the residents of the neighborhood that they were then slowly resettling the neighborhoods. We also did a lot of mapping in 2D and then in 3D that was overlaid on their base layers. This wasn't part of the public effort as much, but this is kind of behind the scenes. We fed those data layers back in. And then and so that kind of wraps up that story. It takes about a week of support afterwards. So we mapped for 2 days, and then it took me about a week to 10 days of supporting the GIS teams to merge all the data layers and get it into ESRI and ArcGIS and some of their systems. So the big lesson is really take 5 or 6 teams of public safety, have them collect all the data, merge all those data layers together, and then hand that as a funnel over to the teams that are coordinating the relief effort. So my role is really just acting as a linchpin in between the teams that are flying, the public safety teams that are approved to fly in the emergency, and then the GIS teams that are coordinating the relief effort. So that's kind of what we did for that particular fire. The lessons learned are kind of what I'm doing now in my free time in between trying to get paid and doing trainings in my commercial business. A couple things that I'm working on right now. One is trying to hack real estate software and some of these other softwares that'll visualize 360 data. And so this is the software I just started testing out this morning. But basically, you can drop links into the panoramics where I can click back and forth to the panos, between panos, and so I'll see another pano over a different area, and I can click on it, and that will take me to the next pano. I also can annotate the panos. So one of the things I really want to do that Hangar doesn't do at the moment is this annotation ability. And so being able to load and have a ground team that can annotate, or a team back in a coordinating effort that can annotate and spin around is fairly crucial. There's not a lot of software that do this at the moment. ESRI has some plugins for their pro software. I'm trying to find some very simple off-the-shelf systems that I can hack. I'm looking at RoundMe and a couple of these other 360 tours. So taking these 360 tour softwares and hacking them to use for emergencies is kind of where my brain is. And I'm happy to talk to anybody that has good ideas for easy ways to do this. The other thing I'm trying to do is link imagery from the ground, 360 panos from the ground to the air. And so I'm playing around with both doing this on your phone using Google Street View, as well as other higher-end cameras that you can buy that aren't too expensive but still are an investment, that would give you just that same beautiful interactive imagery, but do it from the ground and then link that to the air. I can do that mechanically. What the big challenge I'm trying to find is how do you visualize that? So that's why I'm using some of these other softwares to try and figure out how do I visualize this on a map. If anyone has good ideas on that, you can email me at gregory@scholarfarms.com. Okay, just kind of wrapping up here, a couple of other tools that we use. This is a company called Survey. You're able to upload both your video as well as your flight logs, and it'll do a split screen here. You can see where you flew, and this little dot here will move along with the map, and then you can see the video. So I'm trying to speed up how do we map these areas, because really what we need is a rapid visualization, not necessarily 10,000 photos into a map within the first 24 or 48 hours. In addition, you can export these flight lines as KMLs themselves. So I'm playing around with how do we just use the drone as a flying GPS. So I care less about the imagery. I can look through the live feed, and I can, but how do we use, you know, in a disasters, really what they're doing right now is just lines on maps and pins on maps. How do we use the drone GPS as a flying ultra-rapid tool just to draw those lines and pins, and then eventually get to the imagery that bogs us down? So that's something that I'm working on right now. Just today, my Mavic 2 showed up. I'm trying to figure out ways to use smaller platforms like a Mavic, as well as the DJI goggles, for doing these kind of rapid pins and lines. How do I hack some of these like racing tools that we have to really use that for geospatial data? Then I'm also trying to figure out how do I take data layers without internet and then drag those into my tablets as base maps, so I can have like a 10-minute-old base map or base layer, and then I can send that out to the teams in the field so that even if an area is destroyed, they can really, they're not looking at an old Google map, they're looking at a very current view. So, and trying to do all that without internet. Finally, this is kind of a more academic project. So this is just an example from Survey where they have some kind of underwater meter mixed with all sorts of the abiotic measurements. I'm working with UC Berkeley to try and figure out how do we merge a lot of these data layers together. So weather data, ground sensor data, that's abiotic kind of weather stations, with the drone data as well. So we get a more holistic approach to an emergency rather than just imagery. And then finally, I'll be putting together a whole class on this kind of rapid response drone data. Some of it you can do without internet, some of it you can do, you need internet for, but that's kind of what I'm building right now, particularly for law enforcement and public safety. It'll be more of a commercial training, but again, probably fairly affordable, and I can work with WeRobotics to make that available as well. And that's kind of the wrap up. This is a shot from the team on the ground, and I just want to reiterate, this is a huge team effort, both from public safety as well as if you look over to the right, you can see like the data people, they kind of stick out a little bit. So you need both like the operators and you need the data people to build that whole workflow and really ensure success. And so with that, I think, Patrick, I'm pretty much, that's kind of what I got to. If I have some screen shares if we want to go through the maps themselves, but I kind of just threw a lot out there, and that's what I got.